On a quiet afternoon in a small American town, an elderly man in a faded jacket was struck down outside a bar, ignored by everyone. But 30 minutes later, a helicopter landed in the middle of Main Street, and everything changed. Who was he? And why did a single call turn silence into national attention? Subscribe now before we uncover the story behind that moment. The late afternoon sun burned low over the quiet town of Grover's Hollow, Texas, casting long shadows across Main Street. Outside the rusty spur, a roadside bar where chrome gleamed louder than manners, half a dozen bikers leaned against their polished machines, laughing over bottles and stories no one outside their circle needed to hear. Thomas Hale didn't notice them at first. At 85, his world had grown quieter, smaller. What mattered to him was simple bread, a bottle of cough syrup, and a postcard he had just written to his grandson at flight school in Colorado. He carried all three in a paper bag tucked under his arm, his other hand resting on the worn handle of a curved wooden cane. His sand-colored jacket, faded and patched, still bore the ghost of an old Air Force insignia, though time had nearly erased it. Every Thursday for the last 12 years, he walked this same block, slow and steady, like a man unwilling to vanish. He didn't see the biker's machine until too late. His coat brushed against the gleaming handlebars, a whisper of fabric. Nothing more, but the man leaning on the bike turned fast, sunglasses glinting. A tattooed hand reached out and, without hesitation, delivered a slap so sharp the sound cracked off the brick walls. Thomas fell, not like a man punched in anger, but like something discarded. His shoulder struck the curb first. The paper bag tore as it hit the ground. The bread rolled toward the gutter, catching oil stains and gravel like shame clinging to dignity. No one moved. No one reached for him. The bar crowd froze, not in shock, but in apathy. A couple on the sidewalk crossed to the other side. Behind the diner window, a waitress peeked out and vanished like a ghost returning to her haunt. Thomas said nothing. He didn't look up at the man who hit him. He only turned his body slowly, gathering what he could with trembling fingers. The loaf was ruined, creased, oily, smeared with street dust, but he placed it back into the torn paper bag with care, as if trying to repair something much bigger than bread. The biker had already turned away, laughing again, high on his own sense of invincibility. "Watch where you walk, Grandpa," he jeered over his shoulder. Still kneeling, Thomas reached for his cane, which had rolled a few feet down the sidewalk. His breath was shaky. He leaned against the side of a bus bench to stand, but paused as a gust of wind rustled his silver hair. He looked down at the bread, then at his hand reddened from the fall but not trembling. Not yet. The world kept turning. Cars passed. Doors closed. Music played on inside the rusty spur. But in that moment, something quiet inside Thomas Hale held its breath not from pain, but from the familiar ache of being seen, yet unseen. And no one stopped it. Thomas didn't flinch as the laughter behind him swelled and faded like background static. The sting on his cheek remained, but sharper than that was the silence that followed an ache deeper than the fall. People had seen, and people had looked away. He settled onto the cold bench just outside the bakery, his paper bag folded neatly in his lap. The bread was ruined. The postcard, slightly crumpled, had a streak of black where motor oil had touched its edge. Still, he pressed it flat and placed it back in the bag with a precision that spoke more of discipline than habit. He exhaled through his nose, quietly. The air carried the scent of gasoline and grilled meat. The world kept spinning like nothing had happened, but something had. His lip was bleeding slightly at the corner, and when he dabbed it with the inside of his jacket sleeve, it left a faint trace like a red fingerprint on tan canvas. He did not wince. Pain, he could live with. The harder part was the invisibility. Once, long ago, Thomas Hale had crawled through fire to drag two fellow airmen out of a downed transport jet in Laos. He remembered the weight of one man's arm slung around his shoulder, the screams of burning fuel, and the seconds that stretched into eternity as the wreckage buckled behind them. He had not waited for orders then. He had moved, acted, saved. That was 1969. And now, 55 years later, he couldn't even get a stranger to hand him his cane. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed past a matchbook from an old motel, a grocery receipt, and then landed on something hard and plastic. A cell phone. A relic. Really. Flip style. The screen was cracked across one corner, and most of the keys were worn down. But it still worked. More importantly, it still had one number stored. Falcon One. Only if urgent. His thumb hovered for a moment. He hadn't called that number in years. He hadn't needed to. He hadn't wanted to. But today wasn't about needing help. Today was about reminding himself and maybe the world that he still existed. He pressed the button. The screen blinked. Once, twice, then connected. There was no ringtone, no voice, just a soft click, and then silence. Thomas snapped the phone shut. He placed it back in his pocket, adjusted his posture, and looked forward, not at anything in particular. Just ahead. The sun was lower now, edging toward the ridge of buildings that lined Main Street. His cane rested beside the bench like a bayonet left leaning in the grass. He folded his hands over the paper bag, straightened his spine, and waited. The wind picked up. It wasn't cold exactly, but it bit at the exposed skin on his neck. His ears caught a distant rumble, maybe a semi-truck on the highway, maybe thunder, or maybe not. It grew steadily, subtly, almost like the sound crept into the pavement rather than the air. A pair of teenagers exited the coffee shop across the street, laughing, phones in hand. One of them paused and looked upward, brow furrowing. You hear that? The other shrugged. Probably a freight train. But Thomas knew better. His ears weren't what they used to be. But that rhythm, that deep, pulsing thrum, was as familiar to him as the smell of jet fuel. It was the sound of rotors, big ones, fast. He leaned forward slightly. A dog barked from a parked truck. Several heads turned now. The ground itself seemed to respond. Coffee cups trembled. A parked bicycle fell over from the vibrations, and the sound thickened, no longer distant, but present, dominant. Coming from the east, people began to step outside waitstaff from the diner. Bar patrons, now less drunk and more confused. Phones were raised. Fingers pointed toward the sky as a dark silhouette tore through the low-hanging clouds above the tree line. It wasn't a police chopper. It wasn't local news. It was a Black Hawk. The kind you don't just call in. The kind that only answers certain people. The helicopter didn't hover. It dropped. Precision angled, rear rotor slicing the air like a blade through water. It descended into the open field 2 blocks from where Thomas sat. The noise was deafening now, windows shuttered. Car alarms blinked into brief spasms, and people stumbled back from the gust of downdraft. From the opposite end of Main Street, a matte black SUV tore around the corner, tires squealing before it came to a halt outside the rusty spur. Its doors opened in perfect synchrony. Men in tactical gear stepped out, 12 of them, maybe more. Helmets, vests, no weapons drawn, just presence, unmistakable, controlled, dangerous. Thomas didn't blink. The bench he sat on creaked slightly as he shifted, shoulders squaring like a man checking his own formation. The bar had gone silent. Inside, the jukebox paused mid-song. Outside, the wind carried only the buzz of the Black Hawk's tail rotors winding down. And then, from the helicopter, a single figure stepped onto the pavement. No helmet, no armor, just a lean build in plain fatigues and boots that struck the ground with the weight of command. He was maybe in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a service cap. His gaze scanned the street not like someone looking for trouble, but like someone who would recognize it before anyone else even knew it was coming. He walked straight toward the bakery bench. Thomas looked up. Their eyes met. The man stopped just short of the bench and slowly knelt, one knee lowering until he was eye level with the old man. He reached out, not to salute, not to ask, but to brush the dried blood gently from the corner of Thomas's mouth. "Dad," he said quietly, "I got here as fast as I could." Thomas gave the faintest nod, as if confirming an order long understood. The street held its breath, and the man who had once served in silence was no longer alone. The air between them was still charged when Ethan Hale rose from his crouch beside the bench. His hand had lingered for a moment on his father's shoulder, not in comfort but in recognition of a man whose silence had carried more weight than most people's noise. Thomas said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, as if the arrival of his son had straightened the years folded into his spine. Ethan turned then, his boots crunching against the gravel as he faced the street. The crowd that had once laughed or looked away now stood frozen. Phones that had stayed in pockets were out now, half raised, half hesitant. The man who had struck Thomas the biker with the thick arms, sleeveless vest, and swaggering mouth was suddenly quiet. His smirk had drained from his face, replaced by a thin line of tension. He didn't move, but his weight shifted subtly, one foot sliding behind the other like a subconscious urge to retreat. Ethan didn't say a word at first. He let the quiet settle, let the town hold its breath, and realize the shape of the moment it had just stepped into. Behind him, his unit fanned out with practiced precision, forming a wide and deliberate semicircle that closed off the block, not aggressively, not with weapons drawn, but with presence. Each man stood at parade rest, eyes scanning not for enemies, but for something more dangerous: indifference. Thomas remained seated on the bench, hands folded over his cane, his gaze steady and unreadable. He did not need to rise. He had already stood his ground. Ethan's eyes moved from face to face in the crowd until they locked on the biker. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward. The biker swallowed, then half laughed, raising his hands with exaggerated casualness. "Man, it was nothing," he said, voice loud in the stillness. "Just some old guy. He bumped my bike. I didn't even hit him that hard." Ethan didn't flinch. "That old guy," he said calmly, "wore a uniform while you were still learning how to spell your name." The words landed like a slap, sharper than the one Thomas had taken. A ripple passed through the crowd. A woman outside the coffee shop blinked, lowering her phone. A boy, no older than 10, shifted closer to his mother, his eyes wide. "You think because no one stopped you, it didn't matter," Ethan continued, stepping forward again, not fast, not loud, but steady. "You think the silence made it okay?" The biker's bravado began to crumble at the edges. "Look, I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean—" "That's the point," Ethan interrupted, his voice still even. "You didn't care." The weight of those words silenced even the murmurs in the crowd. Ethan looked toward one of his men and raised a finger. The soldier nodded and stepped away, speaking quietly into a clipped radio on his chest. Moments later, a police cruiser rounded the corner, sirens off but lights rotating lazily like a quiet warning. The cruiser stopped behind the SUV. Two officers emerged, their pace careful, their expressions solemn. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Ethan turned toward them and pointed. "That one," he said. The biker looked around, as if expecting someone to speak up for him. No one did. The officers moved in. He didn't resist. His hands went behind his back, and the cuffs clicked softly, not in fury but in inevitability. It was only then that the tension began to release, like air seeping from a valve that had been too tight for too long. A woman with gray-streaked hair stepped tentatively from behind the bakery counter and approached Thomas. Still seated, she held out a clean handkerchief, eyes lowered. "I should have said something," she murmured. "I'm sorry." Thomas accepted the cloth with a quiet nod. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. A teenage boy, tall and thin, removed his baseball cap and placed it over his heart. A man in a postal uniform stood a little straighter. The crowd had shifted, not physically, but spiritually. The weight of their own inaction now hung on their shoulders, and they bore it in silence. Then, slowly, almost reverently, a man in his 60s stepped forward and stood at attention near the bench. No words, just a stance. A moment later, another man joined him, this one in a faded Air Force cap, and then a third, a woman in a Navy veteran's jacket, her face unreadable but her presence loud. Within minutes, a quiet line had formed, veterans of different ages, different wars, but one purpose. Shoulder to shoulder, they faced the street in formation, honoring the man who had sat alone only minutes before. Ethan stepped back. His men did not intervene. They stood quietly, watching, aware that this wasn't their moment, it belonged to Thomas. From behind the blinds of the rusty spur, someone peeked out. Inside, the music had stopped completely. The bartender stood behind the counter, hands still, unsure of what to do next. It was as if the building itself had shrunk beneath the weight of consequence. The biker, now in the back of the police car, looked out through the window, eyes no longer smug, but lost. He was watching something he hadn't expected, reverence that couldn't be bought, only earned. And Thomas, who had asked nothing from the world but space to walk and breathe, now sat surrounded not by noise but by acknowledgement. It wasn't loud, it wasn't vengeful, it was something older, something slower. It was respect, long overdue. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with a kind of reckoning that doesn't need words to be understood. As the police cruiser eased away with the biker in the back seat, the weight of what had just unfolded began to settle over Main Street like evening fog. Thomas remained on the bench, his hands still folded atop the paper bag. Beside him, the handkerchief from the woman remained loosely clenched in his palm. His expression was unreadable, but his presence had grown, somehow not larger in size, but in gravity. Where once he was invisible, now people could not look away. Inside the cruiser, the biker sat in silence. His bravado had peeled away the moment the cuffs clicked shut. Through the rear window, he watched as people he'd seen as background characters now stood with backs straight and heads bowed. He wanted to look defiant, but the truth had landed. It was visible in his eyes. A second officer remained on the sidewalk, speaking briefly with Commander Ethan Hale. No notepad, no formal statements, just quiet understanding between professionals. This wasn't a typical incident. There would be paperwork, of course, but something more important had already occurred. The woman from earlier, gray-streaked hair, trembling hands remained beside Thomas. "I should have helped," she whispered again. Thomas looked at her, not with judgment, but something gentler. "It's never too late to do right," he said, voice low and dry from disuse. Those words rippled outward. A man from the crowd stepped forward, removing a baseball cap and holding it over his chest. Another walked up slowly and knelt, placing a single hand on Thomas's shoulder before stepping back into the line of veterans. People began to gather not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Recognition of the man and of their own silence. Ethan Hale observed quietly. His soldiers remained behind him, silent, unmoving. There were no guns raised, no orders barked. The presence of his unit wasn't to threaten, but to witness, to protect a man who had once protected them all. It was then that the owner of the rusty spur, a heavy-set man in his 60s, stepped out. He looked pale and awkward, his hands shoved into the pockets of his apron. "I didn't see what happened," he muttered to no one in particular, but everyone heard him. "No," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "You didn't look." The bar owner looked down at his boots. Across the street, a boy no older than 8 raised his arm in a shaky salute, not quite knowing how, but feeling it was right. His father beside him knelt and adjusted the boy's fingers, whispering something the crowd couldn't hear. But Thomas saw, and for the first time that day, something flickered in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but a warmth. One by one, others stepped forward. A postal worker offered Thomas a bottle of water. The diner waitress brought a fresh loaf of bread and gently set it beside him. A teenager gave him back his cane, polished with a napkin. as if that could undo what had happened. Ethan turned toward the crowd. "My father didn't call me for help. He said, he called to remind the world that dignity doesn't expire with age." His words cut through the murmuring air. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't demand anything. He just sat and waited and let the world show what it was made of. A hush fell again. The officer who had remained stepped forward. "We've reviewed nearby surveillance," he said, holding up a tablet. "It's all there. The strike, the crowd, the silence." People stiffened. "There will be charges," he continued, "not just for assault, but for conduct likely to incite harm. This isn't about a scratch on a motorcycle. It's about the mark left on a community." No one argued. The mayor arrived shortly after. Having been alerted by local precinct, he approached slowly, unsure of where to insert himself into something that had already spoken louder than any speech. But he took off his hat as he walked toward Thomas and bowed his head. "I'm sorry, sir," the mayor said. "This shouldn't have happened." Thomas didn't look at him. He simply nodded. A quiet forgiveness, not out of kindness, but from a weariness that had learned where apologies end and change must begin. Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You ready to go?" Thomas glanced at the bag in his lap, then at the street that had, for the first time in years, stopped to notice him. "Not yet," he said. "Let them look a little longer." And so they did. People who had never looked up before now stared with reverence, not because of the Black Hawk, not because of the soldiers, but because of one man, sitting still, who had borne the weight of disregard without shouting, and had somehow made the world listen. Later that evening, as the sun began to slip behind the low hills, footage from phones began to circulate online. No music, no narration. Just the raw footage of the strike, the helicopter's arrival, and the quiet aftermath where a town began to wake from its own moral slumber. The caption under the most shared video read, "He sat. We looked away, but now we see." It was a moment that would not be forgotten. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was deserved. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas Hale felt something heavier than pain or fatigue settle into his bones, something he hadn't felt since the uniform still fit belonging. The video had traveled farther than Thomas ever had in his youth, farther than any deployment, farther than memory itself. In less than 24 hours, the grainy footage unfiltered, unedited was everywhere. No dramatic music, no spinning headlines, just the truth: an old man knocked down, a town frozen, a helicopter's descent, and a reckoning that unfolded like slow justice in daylight. By morning, it had aired on 3 national news stations and was climbing social media platforms faster than any orchestrated campaign could have dreamed. But people weren't drawn in by spectacle. They were struck by the silence, by the way Thomas had not shouted, by the way he had simply sat, bleeding but upright, waiting, not begging. His presence was what pierced through screens, the kind of quiet strength that didn't ask for attention but couldn't be ignored. Reporters began arriving by noon, not just to cover the biker's arrest or the arrival of a military unit in a sleepy town, but to tell the story behind the silence. That's when the rest of the world began to learn who Thomas Hale really was. A retired Air Force mechanic, 3 deployments overseas, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 commendation for bravery during the evacuation of civilians in Myanmar. And still, for the last 2 decades, he'd walked Main Street every Thursday like a ghost, passing unnoticed by the same people who now couldn't stop talking about him. Old neighbors were stunned. "I thought he was just another retired guy," said the bakery owner, wiping his glasses. "He never said a word about the service, never acted like we owed him anything." That, Ethan explained during one interview, was exactly the point. "My father wasn't invisible," he said. "We just stopped seeing people like him." The mayor of Grover's Hollow wasted no time. By that weekend, a public ceremony had been organized not at City Hall or the Veterans Post, but at the town green just behind the diner, where Thomas liked to sit and sip coffee with his cane resting at his side. A makeshift stage had been assembled. Rows of folding chairs were brought in. A local middle school choir was even rehearsing a version of the national anthem. When Thomas was told, he shook his head at first. "I don't want a show," he muttered. "I want people to be better," Ethan responded. "Then let them stand for something worth remembering." He agreed, reluctantly. On the day of the ceremony, the skies were clear and the wind mild, as if the weather itself had paused in reverence. Thomas arrived not by motorcade or escort, but in a simple wheelchair, pushed by a volunteer from the VA. Not because he couldn't walk, but because, for once, someone had offered and he let them. As he was rolled down the makeshift aisle, the crowd rose not as if attending a parade, but as if waking from a long moral sleep. Veterans in uniforms that no longer fit saluted. Children held hand-drawn signs. Civilians removed their hats and placed them over their hearts. The applause began softly, then swelled into something full-bodied, a long, overdue standing ovation that stretched nearly 4 minutes. It was not for valor on a battlefield. It was for quiet dignity in the face of public disregard. The mayor spoke first, but few remembered his words. He read from a prepared statement, mentioned honor and community, and handed Thomas a plaque. But the moment the microphone passed to Ethan, the entire gathering leaned forward as one. "My father never asked to be seen," Ethan began, his voice steady. "He never once told anyone what he had done, what he had given, or what he had endured. Because to him, service wasn't about recognition. It was about responsibility." He turned toward Thomas, then back to the crowd. He didn't raise his voice when he was struck. He didn't demand respect when people turned away. He just sat and let the world reveal itself. There was a long pause. "His life," Ethan said, voice softening, spoke louder than anything fists could say. When he finished, he stepped down and returned to his father's side. Thomas did not rise. He simply lifted one hand firm, slow, deliberate, and held it in a brief salute to the people in front of him. It was not flashy. It was not theatrical. It was the gesture of a man who had waited a lifetime to be seen, and now, finally, was. The ovation that followed wasn't louder. It was deeper. You could hear it in the way people clapped with both hands and full hearts. There were no chants, no flags waved, just an echo of acknowledgement long denied. Later that afternoon, Thomas was asked by a reporter how he felt. He chuckled under his breath. "Strange," and he said, "strange to feel taller while sitting down." That evening, at the diner, a small boy approached his booth with a nervous smile and asked for an autograph, not because Thomas was famous, but because his father had said he was someone worth learning from. Thomas signed his napkin, and for the first time in years, he stayed longer than usual. Because now, when he looked up, someone always looked back. Thomas stayed longer at the diner that day, not because of the attention, but because the silence had changed. It was no longer the kind of silence that made you feel invisible. Now it was one of presence, of reverence. People nodded as they passed. A boy waved through the window. Even the waitress, who used to speak only in half glances, now brought him his coffee before he asked, always with a hand resting gently on the table, like she was afraid he might vanish again. It was in that new silence that the letter arrived. No fanfare, no courier, just a plain white envelope slipped under the diner door early one morning, its corners bent and the ink on the front slightly smudged. No return address, no signature, only his name in uneven block letters, Thomas Hale. He didn't open it right away. He waited until he was seated on his usual bench outside the bakery, the sun just beginning to warm the concrete beneath his feet. He unfolded it slowly, the paper shaking just slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what he already suspected it was. The handwriting inside was rough, slanted, the kind of script you learn on your own when no one takes the time to teach you properly. It read, "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." 6 words and no excuses, no explanations, just a request. The signature, scribbled at the bottom, was one word: Logan. Thomas stared at it for a long time. He had every right to ignore it. No one would have blamed him. The world had already decided Logan's fate in the court of public opinion. But Thomas didn't believe in easy endings. He believed in difficult conversations. He had carried broken men out of fire, but he'd also watched strong men crumble under the weight of what they brought home. Some wounds didn't show until long after the battle ended. He folded the letter and called Ethan. "Can you arrange something private?" he asked, before the court hearing. The courthouse room was small, with no windows and no cameras. Just 2 chairs, a table, and the echo of fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. Logan sat hunched forward, arms on his knees, leather vest replaced by a plain button-up shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white. When Thomas entered, Logan stood instinctively, then seemed unsure of what to do with himself. He didn't speak, just nodded, then sat again when Thomas gestured for him to. For a moment, neither man said a word. Then Logan swallowed and stared at the floor. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered. Thomas's voice was steady. "That's the problem. You didn't care." Logan closed his eyes briefly, his breath hitching. "My dad. He was a soldier. Vietnam. Came back broken. Drank a lot. Shouted even more. I grew up hating anything that reminded me of what took him away from me, even uniforms." Thomas nodded slowly. "I knew men like that. Some came back missing pieces of themselves they never got back." Logan looked up, eyes glassy. "I wasn't trying to be cruel that day. I snapped. Like I always do. That's not an excuse, but I'm trying to explain the wreckage." Thomas didn't respond right away. He sat still, then leaned forward slightly, hands folded across his knees. "Years ago," he began, "I pulled a corporal out of a burning wreck in Laos. His leg was gone, his eyes full of dirt and fear. I saved his body, but I couldn't save what was inside. He came home and lost himself in rage, pushed people away, died alone in a halfway house 5 years later." He looked at Logan, calm but unflinching. "I never forgot the look in his eyes. It's the same one I saw in yours after you hit me." Logan didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he reached into his jacket and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a volunteer registration form for a local VA center. Signed, approved, his name printed at the bottom, bold and awkward. "I've started therapy," he said quietly. "And I'm driving vets to appointments twice a week. I don't expect forgiveness, but I don't want to stay that man." Thomas read the form carefully, then looked back at Logan. He reached across the table and laid one weathered hand over Logan's trembling ones. "You won't earn it fast," he said, "but every day you show up, you'll get closer." Logan nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks now, unchecked. That meeting never made the news. It wasn't recorded or quoted or shared, but it changed something fundamental in both men. In one, the weight of shame had found a path forward. In the other, a quiet belief in redemption had been affirmed once more. 6 months later, a new addition stood behind the rusty spur. A small park, just a patch of green, a few benches, and a tree planted in the center had been named Hales Square. On a polished bronze plaque mounted near the tree were these words he never asked to be seen. He simply stood. Beneath it, a smaller inscription, "In honor of Thomas Hale." A quiet shield between us and chaos. People passed it daily now. Some stopped, a few placed flowers. Others simply nodded and kept walking. But it stood as a reminder not of the slap or the shame, or even the Black Hawk, but of what happened after. On Thursdays, Thomas still walked down Main Street, same jacket, same cane, same route. But now, someone always waved first, and sometimes, Logan was there too. Not in leather, not with swagger, just in jeans and a flannel, helping an older vet into a diner booth, carrying a grocery bag, or driving someone to the clinic in his dusty pickup. They didn't speak often, but when they crossed paths, they exchanged a simple nod. Two men, once strangers on opposite ends of a terrible moment, now walking, quietly, in the same direction.